Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today's presentation, 5 Dimensions of Scaling Agile and Large Enterprises, is brought to you by Agile. Now I'd like to introduce you to our presenter. Prabhu Arumugam is the product head for Agile. He is a certified Scrum Master and SAFe program consultant with over 20 years of experience in building innovative solutions across different industries.
Hi. Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon and good evening to people who are joining across the globe. Without taking too much of time, let me get on to the webinar. I think Lion has already introduced myself, so just for a quick update, my name is Prabhu Arumugam, and I'm from Tata Consultancy Services. As of now, I'm currently heading the product called Agile, which is an Agile DevOps product for the modern digital enterprise. So before getting into the webinar, let me take all of you a couple of years back. In the early 2000s, there was this general perception that IT teams and software delivery teams are not able to understand the business requirements. Most of the projects are always delayed and they were not successful. And there was always this argument between the IT and the business that they don't really meet up the requirements. So at this point in time, some of the thought leaders in the software development space thought that, hey, there must be a better way to build and deliver software solutions and be able to make your business deliver better value to your customers. So a lot of these new ways of delivering software, which was developed at that point in time, starting with methods like Scrum, XP, Kanban, and so on and so forth. And all of this were practiced in multiple places. And of course, there was a lot of success as well. And most of these thought process or the methods which each of these thought leaders came out with, all of them had certain fundamental core beliefs, which later was consolidated and published in the form of an Agile core values, or the what we call as the Agile Manifesto now. I think most of us know what this is all about, and most of us who do Agile live these core values every single day. But then if you really look at the characteristics of the projects and the programs which were delivered during those time frames, which were successful, were done by small teams, because most of these agile methods says that you have a small team, 7, 8, 9, 10 people, all co-located, and then they should be able to deliver working software, working in shorter iterations, typically spanning a time frame of, let's say, 1 or 2 weeks, and delivering small product increments. So that was the nature of the game at that point in time, because Agile was practiced in small pockets where they could really try out a new way of delivering software. And sure, there were a lot of success stories, and everybody started getting interested in Agile as a approach towards building and delivering software solutions. But life is not that simple. Most of the customers or the enterprises where we work with or where we are associated with, they actually build large mission critical applications which cannot be built and delivered by a small team. These are systems which actually run the core businesses. So what are the challenges in that space? Firstly, the teams, right? So these are teams which are not small 8 to 10 member teams. We had a huge number of people who are responsible for building and delivering those mission critical applications for the large enterprises. Secondly, these people are not necessarily co-located. They were distributed across the globe. The very nature of large enterprises is that they are there operating from different parts of the world, and then they all have to collaborate to deliver a working software continuously. The third aspect is the organizational distribution. The organizations were not necessarily small. They're not startups. They're not a 10-member team, but they are global enterprises, right? And they had multiple partners and service providers providing support and delivering capabilities for them. So they need to really work in a larger ecosystem. And of course, the other dimension is about compliance. These applications and systems which the organizations are building well extremely critical, in some cases life critical, so that you need to have some level of governance built into the system to deliver these working software. And of course, they were complex both in terms of functionality, in terms of the domain capabilities, and also in terms of technology complexities. So all this complexities and all these dimensions really essentially made doing agile in small teams and delivering incremental software updates difficult to practice when you want to really build large systems, especially with a large number of teams. So what happens? So what happens to those core values which were proven successful in smaller teams? So there were, if you look at each of those things, there were certain challenges. In the first core value talks about individuals and interactions are much more important than the processes and tools. But in a scenario where you have hundreds of people, how do you really be able to interact with all of them? How do you enable collaboration, especially when they are distributed, becomes a big challenge. Similarly, when you talk about working software is not an incremental update to a small system. Now we are building large enterprise class applications, and working systems have to be built as one large product which needs to be deployed for your enterprise. So building such large working systems every 2 weeks, forget it. It's not possible to be able to do that incrementally. Similarly, customer collaboration, again, there are too many stakeholders in large enterprises. You have multiple levels of hierarchy, so you'll have to talk to your own stakeholders, plus you'll have to interact with your customers. So that becomes a major challenge. And finally, responding to changes, right? It's not that simple. It's not like there is a new change and you can just push those changes into your production ecosystem the next very day or the next very iteration. These are big ticket changes. These are things which changes your business fundamentals. These are things which impacts your larger organization. So in all this context, the core values of Agile is actually difficult if you want to really practice them at scale, right? So that's where the problem statement began. And then in the recent past, people have started thinking about how do I do Agile and how do I still imbibe the core values and principles when I'm still delivering Agile at scale. In addition to that, Agile is not just about embracing change. Yeah, embracing change is in a way for me, it's more like reacting to what is happening outside the world. I think it has come to a stage where now being agile at scale is about your enterprise's ability to make smaller bets at an executive level, that you want to launch new products or services to the market faster. And not just that, you should be able to do that with the most optimal time and cost constraints, and also be able to do it in a sustainable way. And then you also have to integrate the larger business with your finance functions and your HR and the other ecosystems, so that you can actually create significant business outcome for your organization. That's the power of true agility. It's no more about just delivering software incrementally every 2 weeks. Your entire organization needs to be sprinting and being able to deliver value continuously to your customers and your various stakeholders. So it's all about the organization's ability to continuously innovate and deliver market creating innovations extremely faster. So this means that now the organizations or the businesses can create new potential markets, can actually innovate new things and be able to create new business opportunities for your enterprise. So that's where the true power of agile and agility comes in, and that's what makes agile something which you are. It's no more a CIO's responsibility. It is something which your CEO is actually worried about and saying that how I can improve my business by adopting agile methods. So to do that, to enable your enterprise to be truly agile, it's not just enough that your teams on the ground, especially the IT teams, follow and practice agile methods and practices during the software development. The entire organization needs to be agile overall. So if we just fast forward to recent days, there are now newer frameworks and newer methods being created to enable organizations to adopt agile at scale. There are many such popular frameworks. So I've just given some examples of the most popular frameworks. Scaled agile framework is one of the most popular framework which people adopt to actually help organizations to scale agile methods and practices across a larger ecosystem. Large-scale Scrum is another popular one, which looks at everything from a product perspective. Disciplined agile delivery. Spotify is something which Spotify as a company has practiced, and many people trying to adopt from them. And of course, Nexus from the creators of Scrum is essentially how do you do Scrum at large scale. So all these frameworks and methodologies are evolving now today, and organizations are trying to adopt one of these frameworks to be able to essentially restructure the organization into a very agile delivery ecosystem. But then the basic question is that what are the fundamental things which one needs to take care of before really embarking on this large agile transformation journey? So when we look at this problem statement, we realize that there are essentially 5 key aspects which any enterprise or organization which needs to look at and understand and make critical decisions before really adopting any of these frameworks and trying to embrace agile at scale. And the rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk to you about those 5 key dimensions of scaling agile and what are those considerations which you need to think about in each of those dimensions before really starting to scale agile across these 5 dimensions. The 5 dimensions are teams, which is where the core of agile is all about the team, the people who actually deliver the work, and the power of agility comes from the power of those teams. Then the backlog themselves, how do you manage requirements in the form of backlogs at scale is a second dimension which you need to really think about. Time boxes, right? And typically in basic agile methods talks about smaller iterations and sprints, etc. But when you really want to do agile at scale, you need to think of multiple levels of time boxes which you need to use to plan and deliver your work. So these are 3 key dimensions of scaling agile. There are 2 horizontal dimensions. One being quality, because in the agile methods, quality is built into the overall approach itself. So it is not an afterthought, or it is not a stage gate process where you apply quality at the end of the cycle. So when you're doing agile at scale, this becomes an important dimension. We'll talk about that in one of the slides. And last importantly, the notion of DevOps, right? It's not just enough that you are able to create potentially shippable software at the end of every iteration or end of every release. You should be able to really ship that software to your customers, and the customers have to use them and then provide you the feedback. That's when you really be able to get the benefit of being agile, right? So if that's what you need to do, then you need to integrate the DevOps processes, the deployment automation into your larger ecosystem. And how do you do that at scale is another big challenge. So we feel that these are the 5 different dimensions which one needs to take care of when you are scaling agile across your organization ecosystem. So let me get into the notion of teams, right? So most of the agile methods suggest or recommend that you need to have a small team, preferably 8 to 10 to 12 people who form the core of the development set. So gone are the days where one project team is made up of 100 or 200 different people, where we'll be able to deliver work, and each of them take care of one layer or one phase of your life cycle, right? So these teams are completely cross-functional. These teams are stable. These teams are autonomous. These teams are empowered, and these teams deliver working software continuously. So the power of agile comes with the power of those teams. But then, like I said before, if your enterprise is building larger systems, you cannot really build large systems with just 8 or 10 people, right? You really have hundreds of stakeholders or hundreds of people who will have to build software. So how do you do about it? So how do you structure them? The simple way is to organize them in the form of team of teams, right? So if I have now 100 people, then create multiple long-living, stable team of teams who then will be able to all work together in a seamless fashion to be able to deliver a larger working software, a larger system as an integrated work product. Right? And the best way to do that is to organize these team of teams around your core business products, right? So that these team of teams will all work towards delivering one end-to-end product or one end-to-end services for your customers. So they all have a shared vision. They all have a common objective, and they all work towards a common goal of delivering that product to your customers. So we call them the product teams, the team of teams delivering one product end-to-end. And they also take care of the entire life cycle. They're responsible for thinking, building, and delivering, which means that they own the complete outcome of the product. So they decide what needs to be done. Of course, they need to talk to their customer, they need to talk to the stakeholders, but they decide what needs to be built. And they then build them, and also they operate and then deliver that ecosystem or the system which they are building, which means that they own the complete outcome. And unlike project teams, these teams are not formed and dissolved whenever required. These are teams which are going to live and stay and work together for a very, very long time, right? So that's a second way in which you can structure your teams around your key business products. And of course, large enterprises don't necessarily have one product; they have multiple such products. So you can then form what is called as a product portfolio. So you move away from the traditional projects and program portfolio and operate in the form of a product portfolio, where each product, which is nothing but your business capability, is managed by a team of teams which can continuously think, build, and deliver value and services to your end customers. So this is a very, very simple way to scale the team dimension. So I'm just showing you a 3-level hierarchy. But if you really want, you can actually make them into n levels based on your organizational requirements. But at the bottom, at the leaf level, you have the notion of a team, which can either practice different agile methods, but then you then assemble teams into a team of teams, and then you then start scaling your capacity per se, right? So what are the considerations you'll have to look at when you actually start organizing your capacity in the form of multiple teams? One of the first important challenge which happens is that there'll be now a multiple duplicacy of roles, right? Each team will then have, let's say, in a typical Scrum configuration, you will have a product owner, a Scrum master, and a bunch of development and testing team. You can't afford to now have the same roles repeating across multiple teams. You can't have one product owner responsible for a team, which means that then you need to now figure out how you're going to scale the notion of the product management function itself. So frameworks like SAFe suggest that you have a product management a layer where you have a product manager who's responsible for the entire product, and then you have product owners who then actually take care of the team level requirements. So the product manager and the product owner works together to define what needs to be built. If you don't have product owners at each product level, you can think of having somebody like a pseudo product owners who not necessarily are from the business or from the product management domain, but they'll be able to play the role of a product owner in consultation with the product managers and be able to provide support for the teams. Similarly, Scrum Master as a role, typically it's easy to share among multiple teams. But nevertheless, when you start a new team, it's better to have a dedicated a coach or a master per team. And once your team stabilizes and they're able to do things on their own, the coach can then be shared across multiple such teams. So that's the first consideration you'll have to think about. Second is, what are those? How are those teams composed of? Right? There are two schools of thought. One is you organize teams around features or feature areas. So these are teams which can completely own end-to-end capability and deliver functionalities on their own. They don't depend on any external teams. They don't own a specific component or a specific module in your product. These guys can just go and pick up any feature at random and be able to deliver that feature end-to-end. Very difficult to get to that kind of a stage, but then it's an ideal state where you have a set of feature teams and they'll be able to work independently without having too many dependencies. The other thought process is you organize teams around your functional or your architectural components. Um, the challenge there is that you have a lot of dependency, but the advantage there is that it's easy to organize teams around components because you already have that hierarchy built into your products in the form of your architectural layers or architectural components, so that you then form those teams around that architectural layers and then structure your teams there. Or you strike a balance between a bunch of feature teams and a set of component teams, all working together for a specific product. The third dimension is co-location, and this is something which is talked about very often nowadays, about especially in the context of scaling agile. Given that enterprises are large and they work out of distributed locations, how do I manage my team? So the best suggestion is that keep the teams in one location, the members of one team in one location, but you can then distribute the actual teams themselves across different locations. So for instance, I can have, as part of my product, two teams operating out of Atlanta, one team in London, and another two teams in India, and all these teams put together can form my product team. So that way, the teams themselves will be co-located and they'll be able to collaborate and work with each of them very closely. But then you have the liberty to then have a workforce or talent available from different parts of the globe, and they can all work together through a lot of electronic channels and collaboration tool set, be able to connect and work together to deliver an end-to-end capability. So co-location is another dimension which you need to think of, especially in large enterprises. Dependency management becomes a big challenge, given that in the earlier days when there were single team Scrum projects, one team, whatever work they need to do, they depend on each other. So during your daily Scrum, you then actually discuss what are the differences you have with another person, and then you resolve them right away there. But then when you have multiple teams, and especially when you have multiple component teams, there's a tendency that the teams themselves will have to depend on each other so that they can complete their work based on somebody else's feature completion or a story completion. So this poses a lot of challenge. So you need to have processes in place to resolve dependencies. Some tooling could help here to know that which teams have what kind of a dependency with another teams, and how these teams resolve themselves, and then make sure that they be able to deliver everything at one increments at the end of the iteration or release. The next dimension which you need to also consider is about knowledge management. I mean, this is not necessarily a problem with scaling agile. With the teams-based approach and the notion of cross-functional teams notion in Scrum or in Agile, we are moving away from the traditional siloed model. One of the advantages of the siloed model was that you had the different silos. For instance, your testing function, all the testers and all the people responsible testers were all reporting to one line manager, and they were all one group. So there was a lot of knowledge sharing and collaboration happening among those stakeholders. The moment we are moving into a team-based cross-functional structure, the knowledge gets distributed across multiple teams. So there is a lot of loss or challenge in communicating this cross knowledge across different teams. So there are suggestions about this. In fact, if you look at frameworks like SAFe or even Spotify, they suggest having things like, let's say, a chapter or a guild, or you have some community of practices which SAFe suggests. So there are techniques and processes which you can put in place where these specialists from different teams can come together, discuss and collaborate among each other, and then deliver better services to their customers. So that way you can actually then share knowledge across different teams. The last one is about strategy teams and shared services teams. So in this team structure, not all teams are just building software, right? Because when you talk about a larger organization, you have people who are deciding, or you have people who are strategizing what needs to be done, right? So there are typically, these are the folks from the product management team. So these are the guys who decide what is the market. They vision the future. They actually strategize on what products and services they need to build and how they want to take it to the market. So that you have such strategy teams also available, part of this team structure. So these strategy teams will work in coordination with your Scrum or the Kanban or the Agile development, the software development teams to actually deliver software. So the teams need not necessarily just be development teams. They could also be strategy team. They could also be portfolio management team. They could also be, for instance, even quality assurance team, which are operating cross product. But then these guys still follow agile methods. Either they do Kanban or they do Scrum or they do XP or whatever it is. But they still follow those agile core values and practice and principles, and they still form a cross-functional team. They do daily stand-ups. They meet once in a while, but their nature of work is very different from the agile or development teams whose job is to build software, right? So you need to have different kinds of such teams. All of them are still small teams, 7, 8, 9, 10 people, but they're all looking at different dimensions of your overall software delivery and system development lifecycle. The last important dimension is about shared capabilities, and the fact that the moment you start forming such cross-functional teams, there is always this one or two specialists who cannot be fit into or who cannot be dedicated to a single team. So these are the people who are, say, for instance, an architect who has a lot of skill, a lot of knowledge, but he cannot be really dedicated to one single team. So you also need to form this notion of shared services teams. So these are people who provide support or provide the required capability for all the other teams in your product organization to be able to deliver that product or services in a much effective way. So these are some of the dimensions which you need to think about when you're actually organizing your teams. And I've seen in real examples where, for instance, one of the largest insurance company in the US today for one of their portfolios have 303 teams, right? So the entire organization has been restructured in the form of a bunch of teams, and all these teams live, breathe, sleep together, right? And then that's your new org structure. That's the new way your people are organized, and that fundamentally changes the way we are used to doing business in the current traditional environment. So that's the first dimension of scaling agile. So if you are in the transformation journey and if you are in the scaling journey, think about how you're going to organize your teams, think about how you're going to structure them, think about all these considerations. And then there are, of course, best practices out there. There are things which could work in your own organization. There are things which cannot work in your organization. Think about all of them, and then come out with your own set of practices which can help you manage the people dimension of scaling. The second dimension we want to talk about is the backlog themselves. Like I said, when you are building small software increments every 2 weeks, usually the requirements or the asks are documented in the form of a user story, and we create a story in such a way that those stories could then potentially be built and delivered in 2 weeks or 3 weeks of iteration. So these are small ticket changes or enhancements which you plan as part of your planning activity. But then when you really want to scale the whole development, requirements are cannot always be that small. You need to also start looking at a hierarchical structure of managing your backlog themselves. And one such structure which most of the teams I've seen which follow is in the form of the one which is depicted here. So you start with the high-level business goals. Why am I doing this product? Or why am I doing this piece of work? What is in it for me? What are the objectives I'm going to achieve with that? From there, you break it down into a large initiative. In some framework, we call them as epics. These are nothing but large backlog items which provide significant business value to your customers. It could be large product enhancements. It could be new projects in that sense, or it could be a large piece of functionality which typically takes probably 3 to 4 months or 5 months of delivery time. You start with that. However, having said that, you don't detail out these requirements like the way you do in your traditional ecosystem. You still have a card which represents an initiative. You still follow the 3C model where the requirements still talks about the card, the conversation, and the confirmation. So you still document initiatives in the form of a one-line statement. Of course, you have certain acceptance criteria. You estimate them, etc., etc. But then these are big ticket items, right? These are not small story which the developers build on daily items. So then from these initiatives, then you then break them down into a set of product features, right? So once the project or the product is decided a set of initiatives, what are the things which I can incrementally deliver to my market? Every 3 months, I want to deliver a set of features to my end customer. So those are nothing but how you break down your initiatives into a set of the next level of requirements in the form of features, and then you then subsequently break them down into a set of user stories, and the user stories could be modeled in whatever format you want, but these are the ones which are used by the agile teams to deliver work every 2 to 3 weeks of iteration. Again, this is just an indicative sample of how you can organize your backlog items themselves. All we are saying is that when you want to manage backlogs at scale, you need to have some kind of a hierarchy. But all requirements are still documented at a very high level. They are just a placeholder for requirements. The actual detailing will happen as you go through your elaboration process, as you go through your development work, you elaborate your requirements. So avoid the pitfall of trying to detail out all the requirements in the form of an initiative. That's not what this is meant to be. It is still a placeholder for a requirement, but nevertheless, the requirements are very large. So what are the considerations you need to look at when you're managing backlogs at different levels? To start with, estimation, right? So it's easy to do estimation at a user story level, where you of course play some planning poker game, or your team knows when you look at a story what kind of a estimate in terms of story points or size it takes to deliver that particular story. But the moment you start scaling, the moment you have a feature which is probably tens of stories, and then you have an initiative which is made up of 100 features, how do you estimate them, right? The simple fact that we cannot get into a detailed requirements elicitation. We don't know exactly what those requirements are. You again should not get into the trap of trying to estimate them in detail. The best way is to still do a relative estimation, that if I have 2 or 3 initiatives on a scale, let's say you have a Fibonacci series or some other scale in terms of, let's say, t-shirt size, etc. Then you then relatively estimate the initiatives and say that initiative 1 is twice the size of initiative 2, and it can give me a more benefit than 1. So then obviously I'm going to do initiative 2. So you still follow the same estimation techniques and practices which you follow at the team level, but now you are applying the same concepts at the initiative level, and you also have to educate or train your business stakeholders, because these are the initiatives which are decided and thought about at the executive level, at the product management, at the senior management level. So they should be taught, or they should be groomed or guided on how to do relative estimation, and then follow the same practices which you follow at the team level now at the executive level, so that they can then start estimating those initiatives in a relative fashion. Of course, once you do the estimation, you also need to prioritize. Prioritization, again, there are multiple ways in which you can do prioritization. Different frameworks suggest different ways to do that. SAFe recommends a prioritization technique called WSJF, weighted shortest job first. And there are multiple other ways which you can do that. So decide on how we want to prioritize. Again, this should not become a long exercise. It has to be very lightweight. It has to be relative. It has to be still having the same practice which you do in terms of prioritizing your stories. Apply the same concepts at all levels of your hierarchy. Alignment is an important dimension. So any user story which you are building at the team level, there should be a feature for which the story is tagged to, and then this feature is actually required because I'm going to implement this initiative, and this initiative is there in the organization because I'm going to achieve this particular goal, right? So you need to have a mechanism where you can trace every work which you're doing at the team level all the way till your overall business objectives. So in this example, tooling could help you achieve that traceability, because end of the day, it's not just about building software and delivering features, right? The features have to provide some benefit or some outcome to your customers, and that outcome can only be known if you know what those outcomes are, which you define them upfront and be able to trace them all the way from your ground level, leaf level work, all the way till your initiatives and goals. The other dimension which you need to think about in the backlog is about quality, which is essentially about how do you bring in built-in testing into or quality into the requirements when you're talking about requirements at scale. So at the story level, you have acceptance criteria. Then you will have to define acceptance criteria at your feature level. You'd also have to have acceptance criteria or at your initiative level, and all of them should also translate into a set of test cases or test scripts, which will then be validated, so that not just your stories gets validated, but your stories will get aggregated and validated across your features, and then your initiatives could essentially be validated against your stated set of requirements, so that the business knows that what we are building is actually is fit for purpose. So managing quality and testing in a large scale scenario with hierarchical requirements is also another consideration which you need to look at. The last important dimension is constraints, or in the agile world, we call them constraints. In the traditional, we call them as non-functional requirements. So you need to now start identifying non-functional requirements at all levels of hierarchy. So when you start defining your initiative, what are those non-functional constraints which your product has to satisfy? Because these are big ticket items, right? So I need to start defining my NFRs at that level and start breaking down those NFRs at the feature level, and then those NFRs gets also broken down at a story level, so that the team which are building the story knows exactly what non-functional characteristics the story has to align to, so that the overall objective can essentially be met. So in summary, you need to have a structured way to manage your backlog, not necessarily at the team level, but at the product level and overall at the business level, connecting all of them all the way till your overall business objectives. The third important dimension is about time boxes, which is where what we call as the planning and review cadence. We typically start with an iteration cadence. Team which does Scrum or time boxed planning, they do this on iteration cadence. Even in Kanban teams who work in a flow, they need to be some kind of a time frame where they take stock of what's happening, review, do some kind of a retrospective on how do I improve my processes, etc., etc. So this cadence not necessarily be in terms of one methodology, but different methods suggest different ways of having these cadences. But when you're doing agile at scale, you also need to look at having different levels of cadence, right? So typically, what we see is that at the team level, you start with an iteration cadence, and then the team iterates every 2 weeks or 3 weeks and builds a part of the working software. And then the product iterates at the release level. So the product now, which is nothing but a team of teams, delivers incremental software every release cycle, which could typically be a month or a quarter. And then the whole business iterates in a quarterly cycle, right? So every quarter, the business comes out with a set of initiatives based on a certain set of stated objectives. And then these objectives and initiatives are then built and delivered in that quarter. At the end of the quarter, the business teams have to inspect and adapt, saying that, hey, I've invested in so much money and created these set of initiatives and delivered this much of software capabilities to my customers. How's my outcome? Is my business needle moving? Am I going in the right direction, right? So now you have planning and tracking and inspect and adapt and feedback cycles happening at multiple time boxes. Iteration at the team level, release at the product level, and business time frame at the business or the executive level. So this is another important dimension, because when we see teams doing agile and practicing that, they miss this dimension of at the business level, right? So it's not just enough that you plan, track, measure, and then you inspect and adapt at the end of every release cycle, because that's purely a software delivery life cycle. But businesses operate slightly at a longer horizon. You also need to have the ability to plan your development activities based on the business horizon, and provide some level of feedback and ability to inspect and then change course at the business planning level, right? And another recommendation is that now don't do the business planning on a yearly basis. Now you can still do that iteratively every quarter. So every quarter you set some goals, you deliver some capabilities, you measure your outcome, and then change your budgeting, and then change your strategy or change your overall direction every quarter. So this provides you some level of flexibility in terms of reacting to market needs. So some of the considerations when you're talking about time boxes, about the duration. So how long is my iteration? How long is my release duration? And how long is my business duration? So we have some recommendations in terms of how long it needs to be. But again, it all depends on how fast or how quickly you want to react to the market needs. And it's also based on how your organization is structured or aligned. The next dimension is about activities. So the moment you have multiple time boxes, you need to bring in additional set of activities in terms of additional meetings and coordination meetings, etc., at different levels. For instance, SAFE suggests something called as a pre-IPI planning, which is nothing but a big room planning, which happens once in a quarter, which is essentially at the release level, where they plan a large set of functionality, which is nothing but a bunch of iterations together, and then decide the scope, what needs to be built. However, still the teams, they will have the flexibility to change what is getting delivered at every iteration. So the release planning done at the PI, the program increment level, is essentially a, a forecast of what they want to do in the next quarter, so that the business can get an idea on what's going to come in the next 3 months down the line. So those are the additional activities which you need to think of, not necessarily the standard team level activities like your sprint planning, your demos, your retrospectives. You will have additional such meetings and coordination activities which needs to be organized and planned at different levels, either at the release level or at the baseline. The most important point I want to talk about in the time box dimension is about cadence and synchronization, which is what I've seen many teams struggle with. Right, when you're doing agile at scale and when you have a large number of teams all working together in delivering software, you need to ensure that all your product teams are all aligned and working in cadence. Like everybody is working in 2-week iteration, and everybody's working on a monthly release, and everybody's working on a quarterly cycle, and they also start and stop at the same time, right? So this provides tremendous amount of ability for you to synchronize and then coordinate work across multiple development work streams or value streams, so to speak. Otherwise, what we see is that when teams are working on different cadences, they are working on different start and end dates, there's a lot of dependency and a lot of weight which will happen. We need to depend on another team, or another team will depend on your team to actually deliver work, and that amounts to a lot of waste. So synchronize all your teams. Let all of them work in defined cadences, so that all your work can be integrated and delivered at regular points in time. And lastly, though we are talking about multiple levels of time boxes, we are not talking about making concrete plans way ahead into the future. When I say that you make a release plan which is made up of multiple iterations, or a quarterly plan which is made up of multiple release cycles, all we are recommending is that create a roadmap, right? Don't create a project plan, right? So we are now moving away from a fixed plan to a road mapping model, where you forecast, or you provide some kind of a look into the future to your business, to say that, hey, look, this is what I intend to build in the next 1 quarter or the next 2 quarters. And then when during that start of the quarter, I will then have the ability to change my priorities if I need to react to some changes, or I will stick to the plan if the market is so stable that I can just deliver what has already been planned to. So none of this means that you're planning well in advance. All you're doing is that you are actually creating a forecast of what you're going to do at different levels of your time boxes. And then the shorter it is, it's better for you to then iterate and then react to market needs. And we recommend saying that have a 2-week iteration, and have a monthly release cycle, and have a quarterly business cycle. And that's the easier way to synchronize your delivery with the overall business time frame, because most businesses operate on a quarterly cycle as far as budgeting and reviews are concerned. So these are the 3 vertical dimensions of scaling which we have talked about. There are 2 other dimensions which are not necessarily directly related to scaling, but have a large or huge impact when you actually apply agile principles at scale. One is, of course, quality. Given that quality is a given, that you cannot compromise on software quality, irrespective of whatever methodology you're using, you need to make sure that when you're building software at scale, and the teams are all cross-functional, and teams have testing capabilities embedded into it, How do you ensure that the overall product quality is managed? How do you ensure that the non-functional characteristics are taken care of? So that's a very, very difficult problem to solve. Is it okay to have an independent testing team? Maybe it depends on your organizational context. But then, how do then you balance testing which is happening within the sprint versus testing which is going to happen now as a standalone phased activity? So it's very difficult to kind of come out with suggestions without knowing the different organizational context. But we generally see is that in the sprint level, you focus more on testing your stories and features. This is done by the teams themselves, right? But you should also have independent testing teams, which then now be able to take work delivered by multiple teams and then also be able to test them in an integrated fashion. So we have seen dedicated QA teams operating around these agile teams, but still located within the product context. And some of them could also be very independent team themselves, which means they are not necessarily reporting into or part of the product structure. They could be outside your product structure, but still coming and validating those quality dimensions of your product. And of course, the problem becomes even more bigger when you want to bring in the non-functional testing dimension into this as well. And especially, we want to also automate most of these non-functional testing aspects. So this is something which is a tough nut to crack, especially in a scaled agile scenario. We have seen teams being very successful with doing in-sprint testing, but always struggle with bringing in testing at the entire product level, and also bringing in the NFR and automation aspects into your testing. So think about this. Think about what strategies could work and focus on quality from the day one when you start thinking about scaling agile in a larger ecosystem. The last and the most important dimension is DevOps, which essentially means that I should have the ability to not just potentially build a working software or build a working software which is potentially shippable. I should be able to ship them to my customers, right? So then how do I do that when they have multiple teams? And each teams have their own ecosystem of continuous integration and deployment. Then I should be able to then integrate all the teams work into one common integrated working software. And then this needs to be deployed and tested and pushed all the way into different environments. So this is where you also have to have a lot of other considerations, primarily starting with code ownership. So who owns the code? If it's a component team, the component team owns the code for the particular component. But if it's a feature team, nobody owns the code. Everybody is just shepherding the code, right? So there is no shared ownership of the code, which means that makes life much more simple to manage. Architecture plays a very important role in your DevOps, especially at scale. With monolithic one single system kind of architecture, it extremely becomes difficult for multiple teams to work together and build integrated systems, because every change will have a dependency and you need to build the entire systems overall. So people are now moving towards a microservices or a loosely coupled architecture model where each teams can then independently build and deploy software on its own. So you need to also look at how your architecture enables multiple teams to be able to work and deliver software together. We also seen where the DevOps capability themselves are formed into in the form of a standalone teams. I talked about the shared services teams in the previous slide. So you can think of having dedicated DevOps teams if required, though we don't recommend them. But if required, if you want to have dedicated skills, have them as independent teams and can be shared across your other agile teams. And of course, also having the notion of a shared environment. So if you have the ability to provision environments on the fly and then kill them on the fly, that makes it easier for the teams to independently build and deploy their piece of software instead of working on some shared environments which all your teams are using. There's always a conflict and who is using which environment, etc., etc. So this is something another dimension which you need to think of in terms of multiple teams working and delivering software together. So in summary, what we're seeing is that you start small. You start with a single team working on 2-week iterations and building stories and delivering that software. And then they then graduate into a large product. When you want to build a large enterprise product, then you form team of teams, and then you start planning larger releases, which is made up of multiple iteration cycles. and then you start delivering a larger piece of functionality in the form of features. Then when you want to really scale now to the larger enterprise, you form such different product teams for each of your product lines or each of your service lines, where a portfolio of product teams work on large business initiatives, and they work on in still a larger time box, which is typically at your business level. So this is one easy way to visualize how we want to scale the development across these three dimensions, be it the team or the time box or the backlog. Now, of course, your quality and the DevOps dimension are being the horizontal. They cut across all these layers. So think about all those considerations. We talked about each of these layers, and before you start planning the whole transformation journey. So in summary, structure your teams and align them, make them cross-functional, make them autonomous, make them self-sufficient, so they'll be able to deliver those softwares. Plan your requirements and manage your backlog in the form of hierarchical structure. Start with the high-level business requirements, and then in the form of initiatives or epics, and break them into product features, and then deliver them in the form of stories on an iteration. Plan and track work, and then inspect and adapt a different time box. Start with the iteration at the team level, release schedule at the product level, and the budgeting schedule at the portfolio level. Bring in ability to continuously build and deliver software built by multiple teams and integrating them into one integrated software and ship them together as one integrated product. And then, of course, think about how do you bring in quality in not just in the in-sprint testing layer, but also bringing the quality aspect across the ecosystem. And how do you test the feature, and how do you test the overall project, and then how do you deliver this whole capability as one integrated software. So the reason I'm saying and talking about all these things in the last 30-40 minutes is because we feel that these are the 5 important dimensions which somebody has to take care of. And with that context in mind, we from TCS have built a product called Agile, which looks at each of these dimensions and then provides an agile planning capability or agile delivery capability for you to now not just have one team deliver software using iterations and agile methods, but now have a large number of a team of teams build large mission critical systems, and then spanning multiple quarterly schedules, be able to synchronize, deliver, and provide real business benefit to your customers. So with Agile, enterprise will be able to now think of market creating innovations, be able to deliver that innovations in an iterative fashion, still being able to deliver that at a scale. So I think I'm more or less done with my session. So please feel free to drop me any questions you have. My email ID will be there in the webinar, and I'll be happy to answer any further questions. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. We are available on LinkedIn, and I'll be happy to take any further questions offline.